Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Kant's conception of the good life, and we'll be talking about knowing ourselves and judging ourselves. So again, the basic idea for Kant is that the good life is the life of self-mastery, the life in which one is truly free. And for Kant, freedom requires knowledge. Freedom is the exercise of the capacity of reason, is the exercise of the capacity that is not itself biologically determined. Acting purely on the basis of feeling or sentiments or passions is not freedom because those were given to one by biology and one did not choose biology. To be free is to act on the basis of the principles that one gives to oneself, and that requires knowledge and understanding. It is the faculty of reason where that happens. So knowledge is central to true freedom. And as we'll see today, for Kant, knowing ourselves is a very difficult endeavor. So let's start talking about that. So knowing ourselves is very difficult. And one reason, and that is put forth in the book by Storr, is the what is known in contemporary psychological discussion as the Dunning-Kruger effect. And here's a very general description. This effect is a cognitive bias whereby people with limited knowledge or competence overestimate their knowledge and competence. So here's just the graph. The graph is correct. That's roughly the curvature of the Dunning-Kruger effect, though the names are not correct. I just Googled this and they were funny, right? But anyway, you see as the competence or knowledge increases, as the increases, what tends to happen to most people is that your level of confidence in your knowledge increases much, much faster than the actual knowledge. So there's a mismatch between how much you know and how much you think you know. Your confidence, what you think you know, it's much, much higher than what you actually know. And then you reach this peak that relatively early in your exposure to a field, and this graph calls it peak Mount Stupid. Of course, that's not the technical term, but you get the point, right? The point is that if you're in that peak, it's a very pernicious peak because you think you know. So a lot of people end up getting stuck in that peak because they don't have to look for further evidence to confirm their beliefs because they already feel confident in their beliefs. But part of the weirdness of that peak, part of the perniciousness of that peak is that it happens when you know relatively little. So little knowledge gives you a lot of confidence, or little competence gives you a lot of confidence, at least in general, early on. So you might reach this peak and you might stay there. And a lot of people just stay there. They feel very confident about things that they actually know very little about. So if you manage to stay with it, right? You read the one book, you reach this peak of like the pretense of knowledge, but then you think, oh, let me keep digging into it. You keep reading, you keep studying, you keep investigating, you major in it or something. At some point, you're going to start going down the peak. And crucially, that's going to happen as your knowledge increases, as you know more. That is, your level of confidence actually objectively goes up. You're going to start realizing that you knew less than you thought you did. So you're going to start realizing things like, oh, that word doesn't mean what I thought it meant. Oh, I misread that the first time I did it. Oh, yeah, I thought it was mistaken, right? So you're going to start catching yourself, recognizing the elements in yourself, understanding that were misguided. The more you know early on, the more you start realizing that you misunderstood things early on. So you start going down the peak. But down the peak, that's the confidence going down, the level of knowledge actually goes up. And then at some point you reach the valley of despair, right? You actually have more knowledge, but now you think that you know very little. And actually, if you look at the where the graph should be, the diagonal line, you are more or less correct. Yeah, you do know very little when you reach the valley of despair. You might just, part of the despair element, might think that you're never going to get it or something like that because you know very little. But as you keep going, now the slope of enlightenment, now the slope of the graph that tracks competence versus confidence, more or less tracks what it should, right? The diagonal line. The more competent you are, the more confident you should be in your knowledge and so on. And for a while, it kind of tracks that, and then it kind of reaches a kind of a plateau of stability. But anyway, the point for us is that knowledge in general has this weird function, or this weird graph within it, that makes a lot of people get stuck at the first, at the peak amount stupid. In when it comes to self-knowledge, that's not the exception. In fact, that seems to be more or less the norm. We have a lot of reasons for lying to ourselves. But when it comes to self-knowledge, we might think we understand ourselves very well when we haven't really looked at ourselves much. So when someone says, "Oh, I understand myself very well. I know what I do, I know what my values are, I know what priorities are, and so on," they may either find themselves in, stupid, like they have not really tried, they just know a little bit, right? They might be lying to themselves, very deluded about their quantity of knowledge, or they may have reached a plateau of sustainability, or they have actually done a significant amount of self-reflection, looking at the evidence and so on, and now their confidence might actually match their knowledge. But merely they're saying, I know what I do, I understand myself, that's not from outside enables us to tell which of those peaks they find themselves, right? It could be one, it could be the other. So here's one of the things that Storer says in the book. Takes skill to recognize that you lack skill. So if you find yourself in the first peak, you might just get stuck there, and a lot of people get stuck there. And lack of self-knowledge does away, or at least significantly undermines your ability to act freely for Kant, and thereby your ability to be a master of your actions, and thereby your ability to have a good life. So it's a serious problem for the Kantian conception of the good life. Here's a second serious obstacle for self-knowledge. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is a serious obstacle for knowledge in general, and it's also a serious obstacle for self-knowledge in particular. Here's a second, also troublesome, though slightly different fact or obstacle for self-knowledge. And one of the psychologists calls it, we are strangers to ourselves. And the thought here is that we many times act for the sake of some motivations, typically feelings. Something feels attractive and we pursue it. Something feels kind of disgusting and we move away, right? We are very feeling-driven creatures. And then we navigate the world. We act in the world more or less influenced or informed by those feelings, which many times are socially conditioned, they're biologically given. That's where, biases, prejudices, that's what all of that stuff works, right? That's how we navigate the world unreflectively. And most of the time, that's how we navigate the world. We just act in the basis of how we feel, and those feelings are the prejudices, biases, the, sociological, societal conditionings, and so on. And we don't think about it. That's the normal way of acting. But then later on, we might start thinking about it, but we start thinking about it after we act. And then we start telling ourselves stories about our motivations for our actions, which may or may not match our actual motivations. This, we are strangers to ourselves, is the recognition that many times, perhaps a lot of the time, perhaps even most of the time, we do not understand why we do what we do. We know what we're doing, what we're acting in the world, and we can see that we know what we're doing in the sense of we recognize our actions, at least to some extent. But many times we don't understand why we're doing it. So in the Canvas page, I give you a link to a Big Bang Theory episode in which Sheldon talks to Penny, and Penny confronts Sheldon because Sheldon likes to correct people. So that's the action in the world. Sheldon corrects people. And Penny tells Sheldon that Sheldon does it to feel superior, that the true motivation, or at least an important part of the true motivation for Sheldon's correcting people, is that Sheldon gets to look down upon them. Sheldon gets to display his superior knowledge over them and thereby feel superior, right? That's Penny's assessment of Sheldon's behavior. And then Sheldon thinks, no, of course not. Like when I correct people, I don't put them down. I lift them up. I do it for the sake of correcting them so that they know better. And of course, there are people out there, hopefully most teachers are like this, that when they correct students, they do it for the sake of the learning of the student. So at least in principle, the story that Sheldon tells himself about why he corrects people, it's a plausible one, right? Like some people can do that. They can go about in the world, and like when some people make mistakes, they can correct them for the sake of like the knowledge of the person who's being corrected, right? It can be perfectly benevolent. It can be for the good of the person being corrected. So that's the story that Sheldon tells himself. But then Penny points out evidence. She says, "Nah, when you correct people, you have this smile. You have this like malicious smile. You enjoy the activity of correcting them. And if your goal is to make them better and they made a mistake, they feel kind of upset and ashamed because they made the mistake, a truly benevolent person wouldn't enjoy the activity of correcting. The person who would enjoy the activity of correcting them is he who wants to feel superior." And Penny points out, and you do that. You feel, you enjoy the activity. But then Sheldon lies to himself, and the story continues. We looking at the scene, I think we can see that Penny's correct. Penny understands Sheldon's behavior and the motivations for the behavior better than Sheldon himself. Sheldon does not like the fact that he is correcting people to feel superior, to look down upon them. He doesn't like that motivation upon himself, so he tells him a different story. So he goes about correcting people so that he feels superior. That's his true motivation. But then he doesn't like it. He does not approve rationally of that motivation. So he tells himself a different story, an incompatible story, one about his benevolence. And that's the one he tells to himself. He is a stranger to himself. He does not understand his own motivation because he does not like it when he sees it. So he lies to himself to delude himself into thinking something else is happening. What's really happening, at least a large part of the story, is that he's correcting people to feel superior, but then he lies to himself and does something else. He's a stranger to himself. So that's a, you know, interesting psychological observation. Again, in the context of Kant and talking about the good life, is a very serious obstacle for acting freely. To act freely is to act on the basis of the choices one gives to oneself, is to act on the basis of the principles that one chooses for oneself. Sheldon is not doing that. The principle he chooses is to correct people for their intellectual development. The one he's actually working on is to feel superior. He's not acting freely in a deep sense, according to Kant. He's not master of his own actions. He's being pushed around by his biology, and then he's lying to himself in order to keep doing it. He's not in control of his actions in a deep way. And the sad observation about this, we're strange to ourselves, is that he's not the exception. He's the norm. We do it to ourselves a lot too. It's hard to know ourselves because we have a lot of incentives to lie to ourselves and pretend that we're better than we are. So we are, for example, prone to exclude ourselves and blame the circumstances. If something happened that we do something wrong, we don't, show up for, we don't fulfill the promise that we made, we don't succeed in a particular kind of project and things like that. We always were very good at pointing to circumstances like, oh, well, it wasn't really my fault because, this happened. And we start pointing to things outside of our control as the true explanations for a failure. And then we think like, oh, see, I'm perfectly fine. However, when other people do those things, we're very quick at blaming them. Like, you didn't, you should have planned it. You didn't, right? So anyway, we have this double standard when it comes to assessing and judging our behavior and other people's behavior. And the prone to exculpation is like prior to looking at the evidence. We don't like to look at the evidence and see our failures. We prefer to lie to ourselves. We're prone to lie to ourselves. So a slightly different way of saying the same thing is that we're prone to see ourselves as good prior to actually looking at the evidence. We don't look at our behavior and say, oh, is that what a good person would do? We just assume we're good people, and then we look only at the part of the behavior that confirms that and kind of ignore the other part. We force our interpretations of what we want to think of ourselves into our experience instead of looking at the way we actually behave in the world. Again, those are very serious obstacles for self-knowledge. So, can we judge ourselves? And again, judge ourselves. Some people use that to mean blame, condemn, and feel guilty and chastise. And like, this is a very bad kind of thing we do to ourselves. For Kant, it doesn't mean that. It just means forming a moral judgment about our behavior. It can be positive, like, oh, I did that for the right reason, right? Like, that's a way of judging ourselves, for making a moral judgment about us. But it's also, we can also do it in negative, right? We can come to realize we did something wrong. And judging ourselves includes the ability or willingness to judge accurately when we do something wrong. So how do we judge ourselves? For Kant, again, judging ourselves is a condition for acting freely, so it matters that we know how to do it well. Kant thinks we have conscience. Other people have said that too and have different stories about what it is to have a conscience. For Kant, to have conscience just is to have the capacity for knowing right and wrong, which just is reason, right? To have reason and the ability to know what's right and what's wrong, that just is what it is to have a conscience. So there's nothing deeper than that. Kant thinks, though, that our conscience or ability to reason and to know what's right from what's wrong is what grounds our dignity. Our dignity is the value that we have that makes other people obligated to respect us. So dignity is our value, and that grounds obligations for other people to ourselves. People cannot just hurt us because we have dignity. People shouldn't violate our rights because we have dignity, and so on. Dignity is grounded in our moral status as moral agents, and that is grounded in our ability to know right from wrong and then act on the basis of that knowledge. So again, in general, self-examination is hard for the several reasons we've been looking at, but at least in principle, we can come to make better judgments about ourselves. Why? Because we have the capacity for making judgments about what's right and wrong. We have the capacity to reason, which at least in principle is hooked up, is connected to objectivity and truth. So how do we do it in particular? Kant talks about this kind of metaphor. He calls it the court of conscience, and he's really thinking of a real like court, but doing it in one's mind and doing it to oneself. So a kind of thought experiment in which we try to assess as objectively, as impartially as possible our behavior. And then he thinks we should play the role of the judge, but also the accused and the defendant, are the lawyer, the defense, and the lawyer, the accusers, and so on. So we play all the roles. We should look carefully at the evidence. So in the case of Sheldon, when Penny says, "Yeah, but if your true motivation were to be benevolent and help others, you wouldn't enjoy doing it." Um, you wouldn't have that smile. That smile is like the enjoying of your superiority. If Sheldon were trying to do this objectively and partially, she should come to the conclusion, oh yeah, that sounds right. Like that sounds evidence for your thesis about my motivation instead of my thesis about my motivation. Kant's court of conscience is encouraging us to do that, to try to be as objective about our actions and motivations as we can. And because we have conscious or ability to judge, we can at least in principle do it. We can get closer to an accurate assessment of our behavior, but we have to try. So Kant has multiple pieces of advice about how to do that well. He says when we compare ourselves, when we judge ourselves, we shouldn't compare ourselves to others. Because if we compare ourselves to others, we realize some other people are just much better than we are, and we will start resenting them, and instead of seeing them as people that we should pursue and admire and try to imitate, we're going to be upset with them. We're going to be, angry, and in fact, we're going to be, promoting our own vice towards them because we're going to be, resentful. And of course, resentfulness is bad. So let's not compare ourselves to other people. He thinks it leads to worse, in general, leads to worse things than better. So, if we do the court of conscience correctly, then we should come out hopeful, he thinks. We will be able to identify in ourselves limitations, vices that we sometimes enjoy looking down upon other people, for example, that we violate our own principles, and in all sorts of bad things. We'll be able to identify very serious limitations, deficiencies in our character. And that sounds kind of painful, right? We don't want to do it. That's why we're motivated to lie to ourselves. That's why Sheldon tells himself, no, I'm perfectly good. I'm trying to do it for the good of others. Why? Because it hurts to see one's deficiencies. So, but Kant thinks, yeah, it does, but that's a necessary step for growth. That's one thing. And two, Kant says, when we actually do it, when we do self-reflection, when we do the court of conscience, something that's going to fill our heart, that's how he puts it, is a sense of hope. Why? Because we're going to be comparing ourselves not to other people, but to the better version of ourselves. So we can ask ourselves, could I do better in this context? In context, of course we can. We're free. We can always choose to do what is best. So the recognition in the context of the court of conscience, the recognition that we can do better, is a source of hope. And it is the thing we should be comparing ourselves with, our actual selves, with our better selves, with our ideal selves, with ourselves that act fully in control of their actions, that are fully free and therefore fully moral. And if we compare ourselves to those, we realize we can be that. So there will be no resentment because it's ourselves. So it will give us hope to do it better. It will give us hope to become the better version of ourselves. That's the Kantian promise. Well, on that high note, let's end here. I will see you next time.